October 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host this afternoon, Brian Gerrish. I have Mike Robinson with me behind the technical desk, and we're going to be joined on live video link by David Scott from Northern Exposure. Well, first of all, the weather, and I'm afraid to say that we've got lots of grey and gloomy reports in. Accrington not looking so good, Manchester not looking so good, Norfolk not looking so good, but I'm pleased to say it's still quite light and bright and reasonably sunny here in Plymouth. And north of the border, David has just told us that there's glorious sunshine. So the sun shines on the righteous, I believe, David.
And the wicked.
And the wicked as well. Oh dear. Well, let's just see. How are you today? Anyway, we should have you. There you are.
I'm very well, thank you, Brian. Yes, enjoying the sunshine, and we'll be covering the matters of the righteous and the wicked.
Okay. Right. Well, in fact, there's so much wickedness going on that we're going to have quite trouble containing this news, reporting on what is happening in UK at the moment. So we'll have to move reasonably quickly through all of the subjects. But we'd like to start off with a thank you to Exaro, because we've been pressing Exaro for some time over the so-called stolen video material. Now on screen we've got an email which UK Column sent a couple of days ago to the BBC. We said that Exaro has restated to the UK Column that they stand by their statement that the BBC did not receive or even seek permission before using the Exaro video footage. Now let's remember that Exaro originally tweeted out that the BBC had stolen their interview footage from their website. We pressed Exaro on that. Did they stand by that statement? And I'm very pleased to say they did. And now, of course, what we've got from the BBC is a stunning silence on this question. But let's think of what this means if the British state broadcaster, with its £3.65 million budget, £3.65 billion budget, can simply hoover up other people's material, we are in a very dangerous position. And we're going to be coming back fairly shortly onto the subject of what's happening in the media or with the media. So there we are. Well done, Exaro. We'll continue to report and we'll continue to press the BBC. But Mike, we apparently should be watching the French a bit more closely.
Well, indeed, because a number of newspapers reporting over the last day or two that the French are demanding that fingerprints be taken in and out of the borders of France, including from British citizens. And this is part and parcel of this initiative, this EU initiative, the Smart Borders initiative. And the proposal from the French is sort of putting more pressure on the whole system to implement this Smart Borders policy. And it's going to mean that all Schengen countries, well, the Smart Borders policy as it stands at the moment says that only non-EU citizens would have this information taken, but the French are putting pressure on that it applies to European Union citizens as well. And actually in parallel with that, just today, the German government has passed legislation which allows them to start collecting data on people's telephone records and so on, very much in the way that Theresa May has done recently with her Snoopers Charter. So, this is an increasing trend European-wide. So the question, and this is a rhetorical question, is where is this policy coming from?
David, would you like a quick comment on that?
Well, smart borders. Smart is a word which in government circles means dumb or stupid or ineffective. So I think what we're talking about is probably ineffective borders. So you have to understand what the words mean first off. As to where it comes from, well, where does it all come from? There's certainly an agenda, and it's towards a big state.
It's towards the big state. And one thing we can be sure of course, is all these initiatives take money, and we need to be focusing on who's controlling the money and what they're doing with that money. Over to you, Mike.
Yes, indeed. So Bank of England yesterday published a consultation paper on the whole issue of ring fencing the banks. Now, for those that don't remember, this is the half-hearted attempt to sort of imposed by government to try to split up the banks without actually splitting up the banks. So according to the Bank of England, their proposals are going to ensure that the ring-fence banks are protected from shocks originating from other parts of their groups, as well as the broader financial system, and that they can be easily separated from the groups in the event of failure. Now, a couple of days ago, we were pointing out that Paul Fisher, who's the deputy head of the Prudential Regulation Authority, this is the financial regulation body which has been recently brought into the Bank of England, was pointing out that in the past, certainly in the past and currently, banks that have a range of activities, including investment banking, would have an interest in using cheap, protected retail funding to engage in the most risky activities. So in other words, they're using people's savings accounts, the money out of people's savings accounts to invest speculatively in their casino banking operations, because they know that the people's savings accounts, at least to a certain degree, are at least notionally insured by the government and backed up by the government. And of course, this is the fundamental aspect of too big to fail. So what's going on? Well, should also point out that George Osborne has said that he will not backtrack on these ring fencing rules. And I've always said that the ring fence doesn't go far enough, not by a long way. It certainly seems that that's where we're heading, because despite the fact that George Osborne has lied that we will not backtrack on ring fencing rules, it seems like that's exactly what's going to happen, because what the Bank of England is saying is that ring fence banks will be allowed to pass money from retail bank accounts to their investment bank accounts through the mechanism of dividends. And they're also saying that the capital rules that apply under the ring fence will be significantly less than what was expected. So really, they are already backtracking on the ring fencing rules. There's only one way to deal with this, and that's complete separation, Glass-Steagall style separation of the banks, and that will prevent this type of shenanigans going on.
David, I'm watching your face closely while Mike was giving his report there. What's your feeling on these measures by the banks?
Yes, many things to talk about banking. It's an extremely confusing area. A couple of quick points. The guarantee, there's a government deposit guarantee. It's not real, it's virtual. If the big banks fail, there is no way, shape or form that the government is going to be bailing out everybody and making everybody good. So the claim that you have currently, 85,000,
75,000, because they've just reduced it.
I think it's a turn of the year the reduction comes in, but yes, reducing to 75,000 is guaranteed by the government is entirely illusory. It's the same way that the Irish banking system was bailed out by their government guarantee to restore confidence. It's a confidence trick. The money won't be there. If the banks fail, the depositors will be on the hook. Secondly, when you give your money to a bank, part of the fraud that happens at that point is that you are, in fact, making a loan to the bank, and it's their money to do with as they please. They're not in any way bound to look after your interests. They're not protecting it for you. So the relationship that most people think they have with the banks, they simply don't have. They're simply an unsecured creditor if the bank goes down. One of the difficulties we have here, because we've got this virtual guarantee, this imaginary guarantee from the government, people are reassured. We're told that your money's safe. We're told that all the regulators will look after and make sure that the banks are very sound. There's no need to worry. Now, the very core of fractional reserve banking is fraud. The very core of fractional reserve banking is the money actually isn't in the bank because it's simultaneously being loaned out. And if everyone turns up quickly to withdraw the funds cannot be produced. So fractional reserve banking as a beast is inherently insolvent. All these government guarantees only seek to cover that fact, and they reduce the real limitations on what the banks can do. So all these things which are assembled to apparently protect us and to make the banks more secure simply means that the restraint that would normally operate on the bankers is removed. It used to be that if you invested in a bank, you could lose twice your stake and bank shareholders, under those circumstances, paid very close attention to what was being done, and the regulation was rather inherent in the system. It is no more. You have to remember that there were 113 different regulators in the United States when the banking crisis hit in 2007. I don't think 116 regulators would have been any more effective in making the situation secure.
Indeed.
Mike, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that.
No, I agree with everything there. But the point here is the ring fence is ineffective. It's another fraud. It's
fraud. And of course, if we're going to investigate fraud and we're going to deal with fraud in the country, be it the banks or the government or any other area of society, what we need is a free press. We've got some pretty extraordinary articles here on what's being planned for Britain's press and media. Mike?
Well, this is a pretty impressive article from Mark Cohen in The Spectator. Lord Leveson's legacy could be the death of investigative journalism. And he's saying later this year, or more probably in the spring of 2016, the following scene may play out on the steps of the High Court in London. An editor will appear before the cameras and say, and I'm instructing my reporters to stop investigative journalism until the law is changed. The naive who have failed to educate themselves on the assault of press freedom in Britain will be more confused and outraged. How can this be? They will ask. They will be enlightened by the editor of, well, let's say it's my editor here at The Spectator, but it could just as easily be the editor of The Guardian, Observer, Private Eye, or any other national or local newspaper or magazine. And he goes on to describe a scenario in which basically, because of the way that the rules regarding the payment of legal fees will be organised, that even if you win a libel case in the courts, you'll still be obliged to pay the legal fees of both sides. And therefore, he's suggesting that this is effectively the end of risk-taking. Becomes such a risk for the newspapers to publish investigative articles that they won't bother. And he's also highlighting an organisation called Impress. If anybody would like to do some research on that, we still haven't. He is saying that he doesn't quite understand where Impress is getting its funding from at this point. So perhaps there's some work to be done there, some investigative journalism work. But I thought we should just remind ourselves, of this article that we spoke about earlier in the week, because of course this is part and parcel of the picture as well. Not only the progress of the Leveson inquiry and what has come out of that, but also the fact that copyright legislation, and particularly using the three free trade agreements of so-called free trade agreements of TPP, TTIP, and TISA, there's some pretty draconian copyright legislation in that lot, and if it does get implemented, it's going to result potentially in, as this article is pointing out, the removal of the right to link to other websites. And of course, this is very dangerous for the alternative media in general, but bloggers on a broader scale as well. So I just thought, let's not forget who's behind this, because of course the HackedOff campaign, the Common Purpose-established HackedOff campaign, is still operational. They're still very much operational. I just thought we'd have a look at one of their members of staff, who's their joint executive director, Daisy Cooper, and she's in the top left there in terms of those photographs. I just thought I'd run through her CV because aside from being a councillor at Lewis District Council and Lewis Town Council, she previously was operations manager for HackedOff, but before that she was a presidential candidate for the Liberal Democrat Party. She worked for the Department for International Development. She was a director of the Commonwealth Advisory Bureau. She was a strategic and technical advisor to the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group. She was a parliamentary candidate for Suffolk Coastal for the Liberal Democrats again. And of course her sidekick there, Evan Harris, also a big Liberal Democrat. She was before that strategic planning officer for the Commonwealth Secretariat. Before that a project officer for UN reform at the Commonwealth Policy Studies Unit. And she's also involved with the Roundtable Commonwealth Journal for International Affairs. and she's editorial advisory board member for that publication. So the Commonwealth, absolutely a key part of this lady's CV. And again, you've got to ask, what is she, and why is somebody with that kind of CV not now running a campaign to regulate the press? So if we just, this is typical of a publication of her previous organisations, Commonwealth organisations, and the People's Commonwealth. Common Purpose are a parting of the ways. And this is really wanting to highlight again the common purpose with small c and small p behind this, never mind the common purpose with a big C and a big P that was specifically behind the HackedOff campaign and providing staff for the Leveson committee itself. But also reminder that, of course, CSC Leaders, another common purpose related organisation being driven through the Commonwealth. Let's just remember what they call themselves. An assembly of 100 of the most exceptional individuals from across the Commonwealth with the purpose of tackling challenges and that business, governments and society face today and build global relationships needed for leaders of tomorrow. CSC Leaders is the renewal of the Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conferences and represents a partnership between the Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conferences and Common Purpose. And so, here we've got the Commonwealth, we've got Common Purpose, absolutely in and around this press for the regulation of the press in this country. Extremely dangerous, and an extremely good article in the Spectator that started all this off, and I do suggest that people read it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Well, of course, David, north of the border, there's been a situation for many years where one or two law firms could utterly control what appeared in the media. So the situation north of the border has been pretty fragile for quite a long period. But what's your take on Mike's report?
It's very interesting, very worrying. There was a point where this country and the countries which had developed from it were world leaders in maintaining the right, the importance of honest public discourse and of openness in matters of government and openness in matters of the press. We realised a long time ago that criticism by the press of our wise overlords was essential to maintain freedom. So seeing it steadily eroded is very worrying. The situation in Scotland is, because it's a smaller country, because the nature of the institutions here depend upon the right people in the right positions actually acting in an honourable way. We have fewer checks and balances here, and that led to a situation where Levy McRae, Peter Watson seemed to have an inordinate degree of control over what happened in the press, what appeared. They seemed to be everywhere. They were running around making threats when stories which were not favourable to their clients were put forward. And the level of control it shocks people from other countries. I was talking to someone from Israel who and describing how the system works in Scotland. They couldn't believe it. They said that, well, in our country, in Israel, if anyone tried to do that to the press would have them for dinner. It would be all over the press, and the politicians or the lawyers concerned would be history. So you're seeing a situation in a country which we don't necessarily associate with liberty. We have a much freer press than we have in Scotland. And if you look at some of the comments that are coming out of papers like Harrods in Israel, which is thoughtful, it is sometimes exceptionally critical of their own government, and they're able to do it and they're able to report it, and they're dealing with life and death situations. And in Scotland, when we see the equivalent, which would be something like child sexual abuse, we see very little making the press, and we see a great deal of cover-up.
David, you raised some really interesting points there. And what you've been talking, I've had my eye on the UK column chat room, because some people are saying, well, we already know that the British press is controlled, so what's the point there? What's going to be the difference with these new controls? And I'd just like to say that I'm going to utterly challenge that, because if you look at information that comes into the British press and media, while there is a government propaganda agenda, There are many, many articles that come into newspapers. They're small articles, but they're giving very important pieces of the jigsaw about what's going on. So to dismiss all of Britain's media as being just controlled by the banks or the government, I don't agree with at all. And we've got to do our best to get the truth about what's really happening injected back into the media.
Yes, we have a problem, but we mustn't be under any illusion that it can't get worse. It can get worse, much worse, and we have to defend the liberties we have.
Well, this is absolutely true, and where we're heading is that you are simply not allowed to tell the truth, because if that doesn't agree with the government's agenda, then you're going to be fined or put in prison or possibly put in a psychiatric institution that you disagree with the government. That's where it's going. But to show that we are watching where the mainstream media is being utterly disgraceful, what better place to go than Littlejohn from the Daily Mail? And of course, what is this man doing? Well, he is actually pushing out that there is absolutely no truth in any of the claims about Leon Britton and paedophiles operating in Westminster. He says, stop this insane VIP abuse inquiry before it costs us 120 million plus VAT. Nothing credible has been unearthed, so why on earth is it continuing? Well, if we go through his comments, they are so utterly disgraceful. I would say to people, you need to read what this man says. He says there's not a shred of evidence. He said the whole thing is a deranged witch hunt. There is nothing credible. Leon Britton has been completely exonerated. He says there's been a myriad of inquiries, nothing achieved very much. And anyway, pervert priests will always be with us. So his implication is, just why make all this fuss? There's always going to be people doing despicable things to children. And notice he blames it on priests. He says that there should be a halt to the farce of investigations right now. And anyway, if they do name a few guilty men, they'll all be dead anyway. So according to Littlejohn, it's all a witch hunt. There's not a shred of evidence. And even if people are abusing children, well, we just got to let them get on with it. This man, utterly disgraceful. I just wanted to add a bit to that slide, Mike, if I may. Should come in here somewhere. Vile language. And what he demonstrates is not one shred of concern for child abuse victims. And he has not done individually, personally, he's not done any investigative journalism at all. Before I get David in to comment on this, I decided to go and have a look at his Twitter page, but actually somebody's taken over his Twitter page and put some pretty offensive material there. I think Littlejohn's upset a few people. So you go to his website, and I just couldn't really believe what I was seeing here, because he's boasting that he can put his pen in a pot of blood, poison, absolutely no interest in the abuse victims, callous disinterest, and then he writes an article of no substance in order to say the whole thing is a scam. I probably could get quite motivated over this man, so I'll hand it over to you, David.
Well, I was similarly motivated. I got an email in very late last night. A friend of mine had watched the programme on the BBC, the Andrew Neil programme. It's called This Week. And it had a piece by a journalist, Bea Campbell, on child sexual abuse, on the role of Tom Watson and the need for a full inquiry. Now, it was a very good piece. Beatrice Campbell clearly understands the subject. She clearly understands what she's talking about. She's clearly read the sort of things that you and I have read, Brian. She's, I suspect, seen quite a lot of evidence. I don't know if she's spoken to as many survivors and victims as you have, but she clearly understands her topic area, and it was a very good piece. To camera, filmed on the banks of the Thames. It then went back to the studio, where she was grilled by, first off, Mr. Neil Andrew Neil, a journalist. And he was extremely hostile and very disinterested and very dismissive, and there was lots of sighing and tutting and this sort of thing. Really quite aggressive. It then went over to the two chaps on the sofa who were listening there. One was speaking, and the chap next to him, Michael Portillo, was very interesting body language. He looked exceptionally uncomfortable. There was a lot of crossing of hands and building of barriers and fidgeting. And then he had his say, and he hugely went for Beatrix Campbell as well, in a most intemperate way, taking the view that there's absolutely nothing in this, it's complete nonsense, it's just picking names at random. He said several times that we're picking names at random. Now, if you listen to the testimony from Chris Fay, if you listen to Bill Maloney, there is nothing random. There is nothing random about the names that are being picked. The names that are being picked are being based on witness testimony. And, okay, 100% of that witness testimony might not be right. 100% of it won't be able to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, that's for sure. But there's nothing random about this. It then went back to Andrew Neil, and he pressed the journalist Miss Campbell about evidence. And it was clear that she was unable to say very much because she'd seen more than she could bring into the public domain, because, a point she made several times, there is an ongoing police investigation. There's an ongoing police investigation into these people concerned. And the police maintain interest and are exploring allegations of child sexual abuse. And because it's an ongoing investigation, she can't go and say, what she knows publicly, because it would prejudice the investigation, might prejudice the trial. So Andrew Neil then asked her, live on air, live on the BBC, to list the information that she had, the evidence, the intelligence that showed that the former Home Secretary was in fact a paedophile. And she just looked at him and said, "You're kidding. You must be joking." It was an entirely inappropriate and ridiculous thing to ask her to do. So it left me with a very bad feeling. It left me that here's a show that's going out on our national broadcaster, on the BBC, and its only agenda is to say to people who have suffered child sexual abuse at the hands of the rich and the powerful and the well-connected, don't you speak out.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you for taking us through that. I hadn't actually seen that programme. One programme, of course, that boasted it had got to 2 million people was Panorama. And I'd just like to say I had great pleasure in pushing this slide through to Littlejohn this morning, saying you haven't got any evidence. Let's remember that Kerry Thomas was the boss of Radio 4 when Nicola Stambridge was pulled off a child abuse investigation. And of course, we've got the conversation with her recorded, and we've played it publicly. So if Littlejohn wants to contest where the evidence is, presumably he'll be in contact with us. But the Spectator didn't do so well over this one. They had an article by a Mr. Alistair Jackson. He's boasting that he's been working for the BBC, indeed for Panorama. And he said, "I've spent much of the past 3 years looking into this. Working for BBC Panorama means following the evidence, no matter how tough and painful the process. But the more I investigated the supposed VIP abuse network, the less I found." Well, what is the quality of Panorama's investigation, or of course the BBC? Absolutely nothing. And as we've just shown, of course, that Kerry Thomas himself was head of a department where they didn't find any evidence because they didn't bother to speak to the victims of abuse. So pretty unpleasant stuff in that article by Alistair Jackson. We've also challenged him as well. We'll see whether he comes back to ask us for more information. But on it goes, because here is The Guardian actually revealing that, oh dear, Ms. Goddard's child abuse investigation has, it's been losing data. So the multi-million-pound investigation under what has been described as a 64th-rate New Zealand judge has been losing very important evidence that people have been sent in. They changed the address or something on the website, and all this evidence has mysteriously disappeared. So in steps the BBC to say, it's not incompetence, this is just a silly little accident. I mean, anybody could make this mistake and lose the vital evidence and testimony of child abuse victims. So the BBC stepping in to help a judge being paid $500,000 a year with a 17.9 million budget to lose information. And the message really from the BBC is, don't worry, child abuse survivors, just resubmit your information and presumably the inquiry can lose it all again. Well, if you have a look at their website, of course, they make an apology. They're very sorry for any inconvenience or distress. But don't worry, just send in your information again. And presumably, if you do, they will be able to lose it again. Perhaps the information the inquiry lost was especially embarrassing to the British government. Now, you might think I'm a bit cynical in saying that, but let's have a look at the inquiry in a bit more detail. This was the target that UK column set, where we pointed out that Justice Goddard, of course, was the spider at the centre of a web surrounded by people filtering out information. So let's have a look at how this works. What have we got? An inquiry running at somewhere around 18 million a year. If I've done my sums rightly, to 2020, that's going to be at least £90 million worth. Some newspapers are saying it's going to be 120 million worth. She's paid 360,000 a year plus 110 rental, plus a mere 12,000 to spend on a little bit of heating and lighting. So that's she should be quite comfortable. Now remember that with a 18 million budget, the IT support, which we believe is Home Office support, has already lost data. Of course, I'm not making this up. This is truthful investigative reporting. So presumably we'll have the thought police on our door fairly shortly. NSPCC staff are filtering all the calls, and we can find no evidence that the police have done any background checks into those people. Now, apparently a contract has been put out for this job, and we're told that NSPCC is only doing it at the moment until the real firm is brought in. Who that firm will be, we don't know. We'll watch that space. The Home Secretary's staff are the ring of steel around Miss Goddard, and they're filtering all contact with the inquiry, so no letters from the public are received directly by Justice Goddard. They're all filtered by Theresa May's own staff. And one lady, Cheryl Mendes, consistently refuses to confirm that Ms Goddard has received communication on Melanie Shaw, huge amount of it, but she also refuses to say how the inquiry will protect abuse survivors, and she also refuses to say if Justice Goddard has actually made a statement about how she will protect abuse survivors. So if you contact this, we're calling it a scam of an inquiry, the person you speak to, Cheryl Mendes, is Home Office staff. And of course, the person she's not interested in is Melanie Shaw. And people have asked us for an update, so I'm going to say today that Melanie has told us that she's still due to be thrown out of her house. She's living in a house with no services or furniture at the moment because she's in fear of the bailiffs. She was contacted this morning by Nottingham City Council Housing Aid, and they want to put her in a room in a hostel amongst drug addicts and some very dangerous people. This can only be deliberate. This is a massive attack on a child abuse survivor in order, I would suggest, that they break her down and the evidence is lost. And what's happening here, of course, is this process totally supported by David Cameron, Theresa May, and Ms Goddard, although to be fair to Ms Goddard, she might not actually know it's going on because the Home Office is censoring her mail. I'm watching the clock a bit, David, but any thoughts on the Goddard inquiry?
Oh, Brian. The journalist Bea Campbell on the television last night put quite a lot of store by the Goddard inquiry. And getting these inquiries was a major step forward. And we're just seeing it eroded piece by piece. The equivalent in Scotland now only is looking at children abused in residential care. So if you have a school with someone abusing children and they have both day pupils and residential pupils, only the residential pupils are the subject of the inquiry. The day pupils are not relevant to the inquiry in Scotland. So the terms of reference are excluding Holly Gregg, excluding a whole raft of other people. The people involved in the inquiry are often the people who were involved or the organisations who were involved in the cover-up. The cover-up is via the Home Office, it's via police, and we get constantly into the who guards the guards problem. So the need here is for the greatest possible degree of independence, and we clearly are not getting it.
That's absolutely true, and I'm going to say credit to Harry Brown in the chat box, because he said, well, of course, the information won't have been lost, and all we need to do is contact GCHQ, and they're bound to have copies. So a bit of black humour, but some truth in what he's saying there, but what a state of affairs. Now, of course, Robert Greene, tremendous campaigner on the subject of child abuse, and Holly Gregg in particular. And you've got an update here on correspondence that he's received from
Yes, this is very interesting. It relates to, this is from the Supreme Courts to Robert, and it relates to comments made by Lord Stewart. I'll just read it out. It's worth listening to. Mr. Greene currently has 2 complaints, as I understand his letter. The first complaint is that a civil action against him at the instance of Dame Elish Angiolini QC. He did not have the benefit of legal aid, while Dame Elish, as he has now discovered, had her representation paid for out of Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service budget. The second complaint is the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service will not release to Mr. Greene details of the amount of these fees and outlays paid by them on Dame Elish's behalf. The reason for non-disclosure is said to be that disclosure would be likely to substantially prejudice the prevention or detection of crime and the administration of justice. As to the first point, my understanding of Mr. Green's concern is that he was disadvantaged in the now concluded litigation by an inequity of arms, although I'm not clear that he goes so far as to state that a substantial injustice has resulted. I think he would say that, actually. It is not my role to give advice as to what Mr. Green's remedy might be. If there is a remedy, I very much regret that there's nothing I can do in a personal or professional capacity to address his concerns. So what's quite clear there is Robert Green's concerns over the inequity of arms in the case of Angiolini versus Green, and the fact that he was denied legal aid while simultaneously and secretly all Dame Elish Angiolini's bills were being picked up by the Crown Office, is recognised here by the Supreme Court as an inequitable situation, and really one which they make no attempt to defend. And clearly there is an issue to address here. Whether the Scottish legal system is capable of addressing it is quite another matter, whether we have to go elsewhere. But this is a problem. This is an injustice that must be addressed. On the subject of Elish Angiolini and money, I'll just record at this stage that Audit Scotland have commenced some inquiries into concerns over the use of public funds for private civil cases, with particular reference to Dame Elish Angiolini and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. So we'll be looking for more information from them in future weeks.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that update, David. And I believe I'm right in saying, of course, that Robert Greene has already had threatening letters about bailiffs coming to his property in order to try and claim this debt, which seems remarkable while there is an investigation going on into who used what public money.
It seems remarkable in many cases because the chasing of Robert by Dame Elish's legal representatives over money started a couple of years ago now, and it was put off initially because the police had seized all his documents. He wasn't in a position to defend the case. He then asked questions on, was there a loss or would there ever be a loss to Dame Elish Angiolini, having discovered that the funds were actually coming out of taxpayers' funds at the Crown Office. Dame Elish Angiolini and her team and the Court of Session in Scotland refused to answer this. So Robert gave them 56 days to respond. They said they would. He said, well, after this 56 days, if there's no response, this matter is abandoned if you're unable or unwilling to answer these questions about the funding of your case. There was no answer. The 56-day notice period expired. And around 6 months later, all of a sudden, Dame Elish Angiolini and team start hounding Robert for the money once again. So it seems to be not only flying in the face of common law and good, honourable practice with financial matters, but also seems to be a very strange decision when there's ongoing investigations by public auditors.
Right, thanks very much for that. Well, as we said just before we started today's news, that there was so much information coming in from north of the border, it was pretty difficult to keep track of it all. I'm just going to put this one up as a reminder. We talked about this earlier in the week. Scottish independents, people who vote no in the referendum, are bad parents, claims a former SNP member of the Scottish Parliament. And he said, if you vote no, you leave your children with more of the same, and then you're a bad parent. That is a pretty dangerous comment. We've got the Spectator here talking about a power grab from Nicola Sturgeon's SNP and pointing out that teaching authorities and universities were being pulled into political state control. So a big warning going on there. And of course, you've been working very hard on the No to Named Person campaign, and as are many people north of the border. And I believe you got some information on this BBC Radio Scotland Kay Adams report. This has also been reported on Alice Through the Looking Glass, a very, very good blog. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think this is the shot of that interview taking place. Is that right,
yes,
David?
that was taken live in Inverness during the broadcast of the show. Kay Adams is the lady that's sitting on the left of that view. And then you have two people from the No to Named Person campaign and two people in the government payroll who are very much in favour of the named person scheme. In particular, the chap second from the right is a gentleman called Bill Alexander. He is the apostle of the named person scheme in Scotland. Yeah,
and you, I got some comment in on this thing, which said that Aileen Campbell was very evasive on the issue of consent. Bill Campbell showed duplicity, or indeed may not have told the truth on the issue of consent. Mr. Campbell also smeared the head of the No to Named Persons campaign over the fact that the gentleman was a Christian. And I've got these comments here. Kay Adams, but what if you did go to them, the parents, because you had a concern and they said, get lost, Christine, we don't want you involved? To which she replied, this is Christine Cameron, the head teacher of St Joseph's Primary Inverness. Well, then it would be my job to convince them that I'm there to help. So if I've got that correct, if the parents say we don't want you involved, the named person is going to stand their ground and say, oh, well, I'm only here to help. So
yes, that's it. One small correction. Sorry, it's Bill Alexander. So that's probably my fault. It's Bill Alexander, and is the apostle of the named person campaign, and Aileen Campbell is the minister responsible. Now, during the show, Aileen Campbell, the minister, phoned into the show. The BBC had her on air, and she was asked lots of pointed questions about consent and about whether consent's required by the parents, or it's clear it's not. Consent's sort of assumed, or you don't have a right to say no. She was then asked, why not? Why not have an opt-in scheme? Why not have the right for parents to say, no, thank you, we don't want this? And she fumbled and hedged, and there was lots of noises, and there was no answer. So clearly, there is no answer to the question, why is this coercive? The quote with the teacher there, it's very sort of incestuous. They had 3 people backing up this scheme, all from Highland Council. They had 2 head teachers and their boss, Bea Alexander. The 2 head teachers, one was the named person for the other one's children and knew them very well. So you're talking about a very sort of small group who are backing this. And I'm sure, since they all know one another very well and they're all very nice people, I'm sure, and they get on, it's not really a problem. That's not the concern. The concern is it's universal, it's everywhere, it's everybody, and you're going to have all sorts of infringements on family rights as this is rolled out across the country. If your child is ill and you're in any sort of conflict with the medical profession, you're in serious trouble if you're in Scotland. But many people are leaving the country. It's so serious in that area. If you are different or poor or don't get on with the named person for whatever reason, religious, political views or whatever, then anything can happen. Personal conflicts and just the sheer variety of human beings, the fact that some of these named persons will be wicked, will have other agendas. Some of them will be paedophiles, some of them will have designs on other people's husband or wife. There'll be all sorts of things will happen. And these people will be in a position where they can control information, they can control when investigations start. It's a huge transfer of power to state functionaries, and there are enormous risks. Risks from personal abuse of these powers by the named persons, but also risks where the state will be able to impose to a greater degree its will on the parents and families and people of Scotland.
Yeah, David, thank you for that. You'd pointed out some that there was a fight going on over this, and blogs and other web-based comment was making some very pertinent remarks. I've got this one here. I think this is 4argyle.com. Conviction of Elgin Named Person and placement on sex offenders register exposes additional risks to children of Scotland's state guardians scheme. Now, this is coming back onto this theme that these named people, of course, they get near children. They want presumably to be near children. This is a honeypot for paedophiles, and we've already had one lady named. And I believe there are more in the pipeline. But this is one of the dangers, isn't it? That you actually bring the paedophiles through the state system closer to the children.
Yes, it certainly is. And this person who's been convicted of a sexual crime against children was a named person for 200 people, 200 kids. And the question is, well, what did she do with the data on those 200 children? Was that shared in any inappropriate way? Are they less safe as a result? We simply don't know.
Yeah, and then if we just go back to Alice Through the Looking Glass, I'll add this one here. She said, Alice is saying quite rightly, the named person scheme is no laughing matter, and Nicola Sturgeon has laughed off accusations she's running a big sister state as campaigners fight the new Scottish Government scheme. Would Nicola Sturgeon stop laughing and investigate what the sex offender has done in Moray Council with the files of 200 children? Can she assure us that these files are safe? Well, I think Justice Goddard has proved that, of course, she can't prove they're safe. And then here we've got a letter which has gone into the Scotsman talking about the well-being of children. So are you starting to see some useful counter publicity from the general public, David?
Yes, the opposition to the scheme is growing. It's growing slowly but steadily, and we're seeing many opinion pieces and opinion makers stand up and take a firm stand against this. The comment about Nicola Sturgeon just laughing things off, this was the article from the Spectator, written by Adam Tomkins, who's a law professor at the University of Glasgow and prospective Conservative candidate for the Scottish Parliament. Now, he, in the style of Judge Andrew Napolitano from America, he says, imagine a country where the government so mistrusted parents that every child was assigned to a state guardian, not a member of their family, to act as a direct link between the child and officials. Imagine that such a scheme was compulsory, no matter how strongly parents objected. Imagine that the ruling party controlled 95% of the MPs and policed the political culture through a voluntary army of internet fanatics who seek out and shout down dissent. Welcome to Nicola Sturgeon's Scotland 2015. And he goes on to highlight the fact that he's joining the fight because it's not just a fight for the survival of the Union, but to preserve the basic notion of liberty that Scots have done so much to define and defend. And that's a very important point. Nicola Sturgeon replied to this.
She laughed about this, didn't she? Nicola Sturgeon just simply laughed.
She replied with a tweet. It said, "LOL," as I believe the young people say today. And that sort of dismissive attitude is what we see very often, but it's not going to work. It's not going to defend the position here, because people are seeing through it. They're seeing through the network of lies that surround. There's a bodyguard of lies that surrounds the named person scheme, and it's very slippery, and it's put forward in a way that it constantly moves the goalpost between child protection, and everyone wants to protect children, and that natural human instinct has been used to slide this in. And then all of a sudden, child protection becomes, well, it's not welfare, it's well-being. What does well-being mean? Well, it means everything. It means happiness.
Well, you've given us, David, sorry to interject there, you've given us this, haven't you? What does child well-being mean? It means that every 4-year-old is going to be tested as to whether they can cycle. And I'll just bring this one up before I come back to you. This is a post. Well, I think it was a happy post that they were saying that hostile and non-engaging parents and carers, there was going to be training in how to deal with them, but this event was cancelled.
It was cancelled, yes. The first thing is, one of the ideas behind the named person scheme is that you can use other proxies to intervene early. It's all based on early intervention, with the belief, which is not backed up by any evidence, the belief that if the state intervenes early enough and often enough in families, it will eliminate trouble. So we won't have criminals, we won't have people who are non-productive and will be a cost to the state later on, and ultimately it'll save money. That's the overall view. It's nonsense from start to finish, but that's the view. So how do you intervene early? Well, you can't wait until there's an actual problem. You have to wait until there's an indication. So they're looking for all these proxies of a proxy for bad parenting. Now, parenting is exceptionally complex, and the state is in no way fit to judge. No way fit to judge. I would point out that the very, very worst parenting that you can experience in this country, Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, is parenting by the state. So the state's in no place to judge any of us on how we bring up our kids, but they're going to do it anyway. So they're going to have proxies, and one of this is, can your child ride a bike at age 4? Now, someone pointed out that Sir Chris Hoy, multi-gold medal winning cyclist, he couldn't ride a bike at age 4. And what does this mean? It, of course, means nothing. It's nonsense. But there we go. More nonsense.
Well, more very dangerous nonsense. And we'll just close with a quick look at police in Scotland, because the Times here in Scottish news is saying that people now believe that Police Scotland are letting them down. And of course, we've also got going on the Sheku Bayoh situation, where we still haven't really got to the bottom of how this poor man died in police custody. But it has been pointed out that there's been some pretty unpleasant characters policing the streets of Scotland. And I'll add in the Daily Record one here, because we've got new medical experts drafted in to try to find the cause of his death. Police Scotland not doing well, and I believe a man who's an expert in sort of intelligence and counter-terrorism looks like the next candidate to replace Stephen House.
One of the candidates that's been talked up just now is the gentleman who was in overall control of the illegal spying on journalists in Scotland. So that gives an indication as to what we might expect. under his reign, if he gets the Chief Constable post in Police Scotland. I once said to a French gentleman when Monsieur Hollande got the premiership, he was very left-wing and was celebrating wildly this. I said, whoever gets the top job as a politician, always make sure you eventually feel nostalgic for the last one. And he said this couldn't be, this would never be, because he hated Sarkozy. But eventually he had to admit that, yes, he was in fact nostalgic for the last one. We may, bad as House was, we may even find ourselves nostalgic for the halcyon days when it was just a matter of police on the street with guns and stopping children for consensual searches and all of these things, because there could be worse things ahead for us. Now, the Sheikh Bayoh case continues to give us alarming information. We now know that this actually quite modest-sized, slight man, not the enormously strong 6-foot-plus mountain of a man that he was described as by the representative of the Police Federation of Scotland. This quite slight man was, when he died, had 2 officers sitting on him, combined weight 43 stones. He seems to have died of positional asphyxiation. One of the officers, we now know, has a record of extreme violence. He beat his own parents black and blue, a situation known to the police, and they kept him on patrol. So Police Scotland kept a dangerous, violent criminal, because that's what that was, criminal behaviour, a dangerous, violent criminal on patrol amongst the people of Scotland. And we've also discovered that he hated black people and was racist. So that doesn't look particularly good for Police Scotland. We also know that the entire incident was caught on CCTV, and that Sheikh Bayoh's family, or those who could stand to watch, have now viewed this, and they have publicly called for that information to be released so we can all form a view as to the conduct of Police Scotland on that day. That call is so far being ignored, but eventually I think that information will come out. So much more to find out about the Sheikh Bayoh case, but it just gets worse and worse and worse.
David, thank you very much for that. Would indeed be very interesting to see that video footage. I can imagine there'll be great effort to keep that secret. But here we're seeing the real power of dealing with what we're experiencing in the United Kingdom at the moment. The real power is in the truth and exposure as to what is going on. So we need as many people as possible to be digging, researching, shouting, posting, emailing, tweeting, writing letters, whatever it takes in order to get the truth out. You can see the establishment recoil when they're actually faced by real evidence of the truth. And we're going to end this week by saying, of course, follow the money is always true. But if you want to understand how and why Britain is being run by a criminal paedophile elite, follow the trail of child abuse and follow the trail of those national newspapers and television, BBC, of course, that are trying to close it down. I understand that the Met has said that it's going to pass the Britain investigation to another police force. So we'll wait and see what happens on that. Final note, David, thank you very much for joining us. Don't sit at home getting depressed and glum. Do something, because that helps enormously. Get out and talk to people. Don't research late into the night. Can we stop what's happening? Yes, by bringing enough of the truth in front of the millions of people who are still asleep at home. Thank you to everyone who's donated or taken a subscription with the column. We still need more of you. We'd like to expand and have a bigger and better studio. More on that in due course. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.